The massive chamber of the Galactic Council floated in the darkness of space like a giant. Wheels spinning slowly between the stars. Inside the main hall, thousands of representatives from hundreds of different species gathered for what had been called an emergency session. The air buzzed with translation devices working overtime as creatures of every shape and size spoke in their native tongues. Some had 4 arms, and others had tentacles. Some breathed oxygen, while others required methane masks. But today they all shared one expression that translated across every species, and that expression was shock. Ambassador Zixer stood at the central podium. His scales reflected the blue light from the chamber's energy core as he clutched the data tablet in his clawed hands. He had brought news that made even the oldest and wisest council members lean forward in their seats. The Valorian Dominion had officially declared war on humanity, and their fleet was already moving toward Earth. The chamber erupted in voices that no translation could organize into sense. Species that had fought wars for centuries against each other now turned to their neighbors with the same question, forming on lips and beaks and mandibles alike. Council Speaker Thalrin raised all 4 of his arms, calling for silence. His species had led the council for 2,000 years, and in all that time his people had seen empires rise and fall. They had watched wars consume entire star systems, and they had brokered peace between species that hated each other with religious fury. But the look on his face now was something that the younger representatives had never seen before. It was worry mixed with disbelief, and perhaps even a touch of fear. The speaker's voice boomed through the translation network. He asked Zixter to repeat the information slowly so that everyone could understand clearly. The Krellian ambassador took a deep breath and began again. 3 days ago, the Valorian military had launched an attack on human mining colonies in the Saturn system. The colony on Titan had been destroyed completely. 1,500 human civilians were dead. The Valorian Supreme Commander had issued a statement declaring that humanity would be absorbed into the Dominion within 1 standard cycle. Their fleet of 200 warships was already crossing into human territory, Ambassador. Velmori of the Seeker species stood up so quickly that her chair clattered backward. Her people were known for their calm and measured approach to everything, but now her voice shook with something that sounded like panic. She demanded to know if the Valorians understood what they had just done. Did they know who they were attacking? Had no one told them about Earth and what humanity was capable of when threatened? Zixter's response was quiet, but it carried through the silent chamber. The Valorians were a young species in galactic terms. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 200 years ago. Their territory was in the outer rim, far from the established trade routes and diplomatic channels. They had never encountered humanity before, and apparently no one had thought to warn them. They looked at Earth and saw a single star system with modest territory. They saw a species that spoke of peace and trade. They saw what they thought was weakness. An older representative from the Thorn Collective made a sound that translated as bitter laughter. He said that the young always had to learn, and some lessons cost more than others. Another voice called out, asking if the council should intervene. Should they warn the Valorians before it was too late? Should they at least try to stop what was about to happen? Speaker Thalron slowly shook his head. The council had rules, and those rules were clear. If a species declared war on another sovereign member and attacked first, then the council could not interfere. Humanity had every right to defend itself. Besides, he added with a heavy tone, what could the council do that would matter now? The Valorians had already killed human civilians. They had already sent their fleet. The only thing left was to watch, and perhaps to remember. Why the older species never, ever threatened Earth far across the galaxy on a blue and green planet that looked peaceful and beautiful from space. The news arrived through official channels. Admiral Jake Brennan sat in his office at Pacific Command watching the data stream in from Council Intelligence. The office was simple, with just a desk and some chairs and a large window that looked out over the ocean. On the walls hung pictures of old naval ships from back when humanity's wars were fought on water instead of in space. Jake had always liked those pictures because they reminded him that humans had been fighting and surviving for a very long time. Commander Lisa Hayes walked into the office carrying her tablet. She did not bother with a greeting because the situation did not call for pleasantries. She pulled up the fleet composition on the large display screen, and both of them studied it in silence. 200 Valorian warships armed with plasma torpedoes and particle beam weapons. The fleet would reach Earth's outer defense perimeter in 72 hours. Jake asked the question that he already knew the answer to. He asked if the Valorians had responded to any attempts at communication. Lisa shook her head. The Valorians had ignored every message from Earth's diplomatic corps. They had ignored the emergency channels. They had ignored the direct warning from Admiral Command that told them to turn back or face consequences. The Valorians seemed to believe that humanity would surrender. Once they saw the size of the attacking, Fleet Lisa pulled up another screen showing casualty reports from Titan. The mining colony had been home to families and children. There had been schools and parks and places where people lived normal lives far from Earth but still human and still home. The Valorians had destroyed it all without warning and without mercy. She asked Jake quietly if the Valorians knew what they had just started. Did they understand that killing human civilians was different from destroying a military target? Did they know what humanity did to species that killed their children? Jake stood and walked to the window. Outside, the ocean rolled under a clear sky and everything looked peaceful. He said that the Valorians did not know because no one had told them. The galaxy's older species kept that information to themselves like a dark secret that everyone understood but no one spoke about directly. Earth seemed small and peaceful, and humanity seemed kind and welcoming. But appearances, he said, could be more dangerous than any weapon. When they hid the truth, he turned from the window and told Lisa to send orders to all fleet commanders. Every ship was to move to battle stations. Every hidden defense platform was to power up. Every weapon system from Mercury to Neptune was to come online. The Valorians wanted a war, and humanity would give them one, but it would not be the war they expected. It would be short and brutal and educational. The galaxy needed another reminder about what happened when someone attacked Earth. Lisa nodded and began sending the orders. As she worked, Jake looked back out at the ocean and thought about history. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself centuries ago with nuclear weapons and biological warfare and environmental collapse. They had learned hard lessons written in blood and ash. They had learned that survival meant preparation and that peace was only possible when you were strong enough. No one dared to take it from you. Every human child learned this history. Every human remembered. The Valorians were about to learn it too. The Valorian War. Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, with the kind of confidence that came from never having lost a battle. Supreme Commander Kraxel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the view screens light up with sensor data. His species had conquered 12 star systems in the last 50 years, and he saw no reason why this one would be any different. The humans had a reputation for being clever with technology and stubborn in negotiations, but everyone had those qualities to some degree. What mattered in war was strength in numbers, and the Valorians had both. His tactical officer was already running scans of the inner system. The young officer's mandibles clicked as he processed the information flowing across his console. He reported that there were minimal military installations visible. A few orbital platforms around the third planet, some patrol craft near the larger moons, a handful of defensive satellites that looked old and outdated. The officer concluded that the human defenses were exactly what they appeared to be, which was barely adequate for a species of their size. Kraxel felt satisfaction wash over him. The Council's reputation for humanity must have been exaggerated stories told to scare younger species into behaving. He had heard whispers that Earth was dangerous and that humans were not to be trifled with, but looking at the scan results, he saw nothing that justified such warnings. Perhaps humans were good at trading or diplomacy, but when it came to actual military power, they seemed as weak as any other small civilization. Clinging to a single star, he ordered the fleet to assume attack formation and begin moving toward the inner system. 200 warships arranged themselves into 3 waves with the heavy cruisers in front, the carriers holding back to launch fighters when needed. It was a standard assault pattern that had worked against every enemy the Valorians had ever faced. Kraxel allowed himself to imagine the victory celebration that would follow. The Dominion would gain a foothold in this sector. His name would be remembered as the commander who brought humanity to heel. On the moon called Luna that orbited Earth, a very different mood filled. The command center at Armstrong Base, Captain Greg Foster sat in the commander's chair watching the same sensor data that the Valorians were seeing, but he was watching it with very different eyes. He noted that the Valorian fleet was not even bothering with proper defensive spacing. Their ships were clustered together like they expected no resistance. Their formation was designed purely for offense with no thought given to protecting themselves from counterattack. Lieutenant Kate Morrison stood beside him, reviewing the tactical breakdown. She had been in the service for 15 years and had studied every major fleet engagement in human history. She recognized the Valorian formation from the textbooks as something that would have been effective, maybe 200 years ago. Now it was just a way to make sure that when the shooting started, a lot of ships would be hit at once. She asked Greg if they should inform the Valorians of their mistake, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Greg smiled without humor. He said that some lessons could not be taught with words. Some species had to experience defeat directly before they would believe it was possible. He gave the order to activate the network, and across the solar system things that had been sleeping began to wake up. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter held thousands of rocks tumbling through space in their ancient orbits. Most of them were exactly what they appeared to be, which was lifeless stone drifting in the dark. But scattered among them were 36 objects that looked like asteroids but were actually military installations. They had been built over decades with careful attention to making them appear natural. Their surfaces were covered in real rock, and their energy signatures were carefully masked. Now, those installations powered up weapons that had been waiting patiently for a moment like this. On the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, more hidden bases came online. What had appeared to be mining facilities and research stations revealed their true nature as military fortifications. Weapons that could crack a moon in half rotated silently toward the approaching Valorian fleet. Defensive shields that could stop anything short of a star-going nova hummed to life. Communication arrays that could coordinate a battle across millions of kilometers began linking every human asset into one unified network. And then the ships began to appear. The USS Valkyrie decloaked near Jupiter's orbit, and for a moment it hung in space like a dark blade catching starlight. It was humanity's first Dreadnought-class warship, and it was 3 times larger than the biggest Valorian cruiser. Its hull was made from materials that had taken 50 years to develop, and its weapons were based on theories that most species had dismissed as impossible. Captain Ben Rodriguez stood on its bridge and watched as 30 more warships decloaked around him. Cruisers and destroyers and frigates all appearing out of nothing like ghosts. Materializing in the dark, Ben opened a communication channel to the Valorian fleet. His voice was calm and professional as he identified himself and his ship. He informed Supreme Commander Kraxel that the Valorians had attacked human civilians without provocation. He stated that under the laws of war recognized by the Galactic Council, humanity had the right to defend itself with all available force. He offered the Valorians one chance, and only one chance to surrender immediately. He told them to power down their weapons and prepare to be boarded or face the consequences of their actions. On the Valorian flagship, Kraxel stared at the display screen in confusion. Where had these human ships come from? His sensors had shown nothing, and then suddenly there were dozens of warships appearing out of empty space. He checked the tactical display and saw that his fleet still outnumbered the humans by more than 6 to 1. The human ships were larger than he had expected, but numbers still mattered in warfare. He made a decision based on decades of military experience and centuries of Valorian doctrine. He decided that the humans were bluffing. He sent a response to Captain Rodriguez that dripped with contempt. He said that humanity's threats were empty words from a weak species. He pointed out that the Valorian fleet had superior numbers and that Earth would fall within the day. He suggested that the humans save themselves the trouble of fighting and surrender immediately. He promised that if they cooperated, the occupation would be peaceful and their civilians would be treated fairly. Ben listened to the translation of Kraxel's response and felt something that might have been pity. He closed the channel without bothering to reply. There was nothing left to say. He turned to his weapons officer and gave the order that every human commander in the system had been waiting to hear. Weapons free. Engage at will. End this quickly. Throughout the solar system, human weapons officers received the same order at the same moment. Fingers moved over controls with practiced precision, targeting computers that had been tracking the Valorian fleet since it entered the system locked onto their designated targets. Safeties were released. Power levels reached maximum. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch forever in the silence of space, humanity showed the Valorians exactly why the older species never threatened Earth: the hidden weapons platforms. In the asteroid belt fired first, railguns accelerated metal slugs to a significant fraction of light speed. The projectiles crossed millions of kilometers in seconds. They hit Valorian shields with the force of small nuclear weapons. Shields that had seemed strong against every previous enemy collapsed like paper. Hulls designed to withstand conventional weapons tore apart as hypersonic rounds passed through them like they were not even there. The Valorian fleet's sensors screamed warnings, but there was no time to react. More railgun rounds arrived from different angles. Then came the directed energy weapons firing from the hidden bases on moons and planets. Beams of concentrated energy hot enough to melt steel in microseconds carved through Valorian armor. Ships that had survived 100 battles died in moments, and then the human fleet opened fire. The USS Valkyrie's main guns spoke, and what came out was not fire or plasma or any conventional weapon. They were kinetic kill vehicles moving at relativistic speeds. When they hit a Valorian cruiser, the ship did not explode dramatically. It simply ceased to exist, as matter was converted to energy in a flash that briefly outshone the distant sun. The other human ships fired with surgical precision. They targeted engines and weapon systems, rather than going for killing blows. It was the difference between fighting to destroy and fighting to disable. Humanity wanted prisoners and answers and proof that they had offered mercy even to those who showed them none. But mercy did not mean weakness. Within 5 minutes of the first shot, 50 Valorian warships were crippled and drifting. Supreme Commander Kraxel watched his fleet die around him and could not understand what was happening. His tactical officer's voice had risen to a panicked pitch as he tried to count the human weapons platforms that kept revealing themselves. There were weapons everywhere. In the asteroid belt, on moons, hidden in orbital debris, disguised as civilian satellites. The humans had turned their entire solar system into a fortress, and no one had known. Kraxel gave the order to retreat, but found that retreat was not an option. Human ships had moved to cut off escape routes. When Valorian vessels tried to activate their faster-than-light drives, they found that the drives would not engage. Some kind of human technology was creating interference that prevented the ships from jumping to safety. They were trapped in a system that had become a killing ground, and there was nowhere to run. The battle that the Valorians had expected. 2 last hours was effectively over in the first 10 minutes, but the shooting continued because some of the Valorian commanders either did not believe what was happening or refused to accept it. They kept firing their weapons at human ships and watching in growing horror as their best shots were absorbed by shields that seemed impossibly strong. Plasma torpedoes that could melt through reinforced titanium exploded harmlessly against defensive barriers that shimmered blue and then returned to transparency. Particle beams that had carved up enemy fleets in previous wars scattered uselessly across energy fields that bent. Physics in ways the Valorians had thought were purely theoretical. On the bridge of the USS Valkyrie Tactical, Officer Helen Parker watched her display with the calm detachment of someone who had trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times in simulation. She called out the damage reports in a steady voice, noting that the Valorian weapons were approximately 3 generations behind current human military technology. The shields were operating at only 15% capacity because they simply did not need to work any harder. Some of the junior officers on the bridge had never seen real combat before, and they looked almost disappointed at how one-sided the engagement was turning out to be. Captain Ben Rodriguez understood their feelings, but he also understood something that came with experience and age. War was not supposed to be exciting or glorious or fair. War was supposed to end as quickly as possible with the minimum loss of life on all sides. He gave orders that reflected that philosophy. He told his weapons crews to target propulsion systems and power generators. Disable, but do not destroy. Capture, but do not kill. The Valorians had made a terrible mistake. That did not mean every single one of them needed to die for it. The human fleet moved through the Valorian formation, like surgeons working on a patient. Each shot was calculated and precise. Railgun rounds were adjusted to penetrate just deep enough to destroy engine cores without rupturing fuel containment. Energy beams were focused to cut through specific systems while leaving life support intact. It was a level of accuracy that spoke to both advanced technology and extensive training. The Valorians had built their military around overwhelming force and aggressive tactics. Humanity had built theirs around the principle that every shot should count, and every victory should cost as few lives as possible, even enemy lives. Valorian Destroyer tried to make a run toward Earth itself, perhaps hoping to at least strike at the human homeworld before being destroyed. It accelerated hard, burning through its fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate. The ship made it almost to Mars orbit before 3 human frigates intercepted it. They did not blow it apart. Instead, they used tractor beams to lock onto the destroyer's hull and simply stopped it in space. The Valorian ship's engines screamed as they fought against the tractor beams, but it was like an insect struggling in amber. The ship could not move forward or backward or turn. It just hung there in space completely helpless until a boarding team could be assembled. Back at the main battle Supreme Commander, Craxel was trying to organize a defense, but his fleet was falling apart around him faster than he could issue orders. His communication channels were filled with panicked voices, calling for instructions or reporting catastrophic damage or simply screaming. One of his carrier groups had lost every single ship in the span of 3 minutes. A squadron of his best fighters had launched and been swatted from space by point defense systems so accurate that not a single Basire human shot had been wasted. His heavy cruisers, which were supposed to be the backbone of Valorian military might, were drifting hulks with their crews abandoning ship in escape pods. The tactical officer reported something that made Craxela's blood run cold in his veins. He said that the human weapons platforms were everywhere throughout the entire solar system. There were weapons hidden in the asteroid belt that had been disguised as simple rocks for who knew how many years. There were defensive satellites around every planet and moon that had been broadcasting civilian identification codes but were now revealed as military hardware. There were installations on planetary surfaces that looked like mining facilities or research stations but were actually fortified weapons emplacements. The humans had weaponized their entire solar system and done it so carefully that no one had noticed. Craxel asked the question that he was afraid to hear answered. He asked how many weapons platforms the humans had hidden throughout their system. The tactical officer worked at his console for a moment and then gave up. He said that he could not count them all. Every time the sensors swept the system, they found more. Hundreds, certainly. Maybe thousands. It was like the humans had spent centuries preparing for this exact moment and had decided that if anyone ever attacked Earth, they would find themselves fighting. Not just a fleet, but an entire solar system turned into a weapon. On the Galactic Council Station, representatives from across the galaxy watched the battle unfold through feeds provided by automated observation posts. The chamber that had been filled with shocked voices earlier was now completely silent. Even the species that had fought humanity in the past and knew something of their capabilities looked stunned at the sheer scale of the defensive network being revealed. This was not just military preparedness. This was a level of dedication to survival that bordered on obsessive. Ambassador Vel Maria of the Seekers had seen the rise and fall of civilizations across 3,000 years. Her species valued knowledge above all else, and they had made it their business to understand every major power in the galaxy. She had studied humanity for decades and thought she understood them. Now, watching the battle, she realized that no one truly understood them. Every species prepared for war to some degree, but humanity had taken that preparation to an extreme that defied logic. They had turned their home system into a death trap, so elaborate and so complete that attacking Earth was not an act of war, but an act of suicide. Another council member asked if they should intervene to stop the slaughter, but Velmaria shook her head. She pointed out that the humans were not slaughtering anyone. Despite having overwhelming advantage, they were disabling ships rather than destroying them. They were capturing escape pods rather than leaving survivors to drift in space. They were following the rules of warfare as defined by the Council, even though the Valorians had broken those same rules by attacking civilians first. Humanity was showing remarkable restraint under the circumstances. Speaker. Thalrin watched the feeds with his 4 eyes, moving independently to track different parts of the battlefield. He had been leader of the Council for 60 years, and in that time, he had authorized 3 interventions to stop genocidal wars. This was not one of those situations. This was simply a young species learning a very old lesson about why certain powers were left alone. He ordered the Council to take no action, but to keep recording everything. This battle would become required viewing for every new species that joined the Council. It would serve as education about what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening Earth. The battle continued for another hour, but only because it took that long for the human forces to systematically disable or capture every Valorian ship. Some Valorian crews surrendered quickly once they realized the situation was hopeless. Others fought until their weapons were destroyed and their ships were boarded by human marines in powered armor. A few captains chose to go down with their ships rather than face the shame of defeat. But whether they surrendered or fought or chose death, the outcome was the same. The Valorian war fleet that had entered the solar system with 200 ships and absolute confidence was reduced to wreckage and prisoners. When the last Valorian vessel was secured, Captain Ben Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie and looked at the tactical display. The entire engagement from first shot to final capture had lasted 90 minutes. Not a single human ship had been destroyed. The few hits that human vessels had taken had been absorbed by shields and armor. There were some minor injuries among the crews, but no deaths. It had been as close to a perfect military victory as anyone could ask for, and that fact made Ben feel tired rather than triumphant. He opened a channel to all human forces in the system. He thanked them for their professionalism and their precision. He reminded them that the prisoners were to be treated according to the conventions of war, and that any abuse would be punished severely. He told them that they had defended Earth and defended it well, but that their job now was to show the galaxy that humanity could be merciful in victory. The Valorians had killed human civilians, and for that, there would be justice, but justice did not mean cruelty. On the Valorian flagship, Kraxel sat in his command chair and stared at nothing. His ship had been boarded 10 minutes ago, and human marines now controlled the bridge. They had been efficient and professional. They had not killed anyone who did not resist. They had provided medical care to the wounded. They had treated prisoners with a level of respect that Kraxel had not expected from a species he had thought was weak and primitive. That somehow made everything worse. It would have been easier to accept defeat from monsters. Being defeated so completely by people who then showed kindness was harder to bear than any physical injury. A human officer approached him. It was a woman with short dark hair and the rank insignia of a commander. She told Kraxel that he was being taken into custody and would be transported to a holding facility to await trial. She informed him that he had the right to legal representation and that the Galactic Council would be notified of his capture. She asked if he understood and if he needed medical attention. Her voice was calm and professional, like she was processing paperwork rather than dealing with the commander of an invasion force that had just been utterly destroyed. Kraxel asked her one question. He asked why no one had warned him. Why had the Council not told the Valorians what they were facing when they threatened Earth? Why had the older species kept silent and let his people walk into a slaughter? The human commander looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said that the information was not secret. Any species that cared to look could find records of human military capabilities. The problem was that most species looked at Earth, saw a small territory and a peaceful culture, and assumed that meant weakness. They did not look deeper. They did not ask why such a peaceful species maintained such an enormous military. They did not wonder what had made humanity so determined never to be vulnerable again. She told him that he would have time to think about that question in the days to come. Then she gestured to the Marines, and they led Kraxel away from his bridge for the last time. The orbital detention facility hung in space, above Earth like a small moon made of metal and reinforced glass. It had been built 50 years ago, during a period when humanity was expanding rapidly and needed a place to hold prisoners from various conflicts. The facility had never been full. Till now, 3,000 Valorian soldiers and officers occupied cells that were clean in temperature, controlled with regular meals and access to medical care. By any measure, they were being treated well. But they were still prisoners, and the weight of their defeat hung over them like a physical thing. Admiral Jake Brennan arrived at the facility 2 days after the battle ended. He had spent those 2 days coordinating the cleanup operation and filing reports and dealing with diplomatic messages from a dozen different species, all asking the same basic question, which was whether humanity intended to invade Valorian territory in response. His answer had been the same each time. Humanity did not want territory or revenge. They wanted peace, and they wanted to make sure this never happened again. Now he walked through the pristine white corridors of the detention facility, with 2 guards following at a respectful distance. He was here to see Supreme Commander Kraxel not because regulations required it, but because he thought it was important. The Valorians needed to understand what had happened and why. More importantly, they needed to understand what humanity was and why the galaxy's older species had never bothered to warn them. That knowledge might prevent future wars, or at least make the next generation of Valorian leaders think twice before attacking anyone. The cell where Kraxel was being held was larger than most, with a bed and a desk, and a small window that showed Earth turning slowly below. The Valorian commander sat at the desk, staring at that view when Jake entered. He did not turn around or acknowledge the visitor. His posture spoke of defeat and shame, and perhaps a deeper kind of confusion that came from having your entire understanding of the universe proven wrong in the span of 90 minutes. Jake dismissed the guards and waited until the door closed before speaking. He introduced himself and explained that he commanded all human military forces in the Pacific region of Earth. He said that he wanted to talk not as captor to prisoner, but as one military officer to another. He wanted Kraxel to understand what had happened, and more importantly, why it had happened. He believed that understanding might help prevent this kind of tragedy in the future. Kraxel finally turned to look at him. The Valorian's eyes were different from human eyes, but the expression in them translated clearly enough. It was the look of someone who had lost everything, including their certainty about how the universe worked. He asked Jake the same question he had asked the human commander on his ship. He asked why no one had warned the Valorians. Why had the council remained silent? Why had the older species allowed this to happen when a simple warning could have prevented it? Jake pulled up a holographic display from the tablet he carried. The display showed Earth as it had looked 400 years ago. The planet was brown and gray in places where it should have been green. The ice caps were smaller than they should have been. The oceans were darker. Even from space, it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. Jake explained that this was Earth during what humans called the collapse. It was a time when humanity had almost destroyed itself through a combination of nuclear war and biological weapons and environmental catastrophe. 3 billion people died in the span of 20 years. Entire nations ceased to exist. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to radioactive ruins. He changed the display to show scenes from that period. Images that had been preserved in archives as reminders of what humanity must never allow to happen again. There were pictures of burning cities and refugees fleeing across dead landscapes and children with haunted eyes staring at cameras. There were records of the final nuclear exchange that had pushed civilization to the brink of complete extinction. There were documents detailing the biological plagues that followed and the environmental collapse that nearly finished what the weapons had started. Kraxel watched the images with growing horror. He had studied military history and he understood warfare, But this was something beyond war. This was a species trying to kill itself. He asked why humanity had done this. What could possibly drive an intelligent species to such self-destructive madness? Jake's answer was simple and terrible. He said that humanity had done it because they could. Because they had built weapons without fully understanding the consequences. Because they had let fear and anger and ideology override common sense. Because they had believed that their enemies were so evil that any action was justified. Because they had forgotten that everyone on Earth was human and that there was nowhere to run. If they destroyed their own world, the display changed again to show Earth as it was now. Blue and green and beautiful, with white clouds swirling in patterns that looked almost artistic. Jake explained that it had taken humanity 200 years to recover from the collapse. 200 years of hard work and sacrifice and determination to build something better. During those years, humanity had learned lessons that were written in the bones of their civilization. They had learned that survival required preparation. They had learned that peace only lasted when you were strong enough that war seemed too costly. They had learned that every weapon ever built would eventually be used unless something prevented it. Most importantly, they had learned that their own planet was precious beyond measure, because it was the only one they had. He changed the display once more to show the construction timeline of Earth's defensive network. It had started small, with just a few orbital platforms and some ships, but generation after generation had added to it. Every year, more satellites were launched with dual-purpose civilian and military functions. Every decade, another moon base was built that looked like a research station but could turn into a fortress in minutes. Every asteroid that was mined for resources was also evaluated as a potential weapons platform. It had taken 3 centuries to turn the entire solar system into the defensive network that had destroyed the Valorian fleet, but humanity had done it because they remembered what happened when they were unprepared. Craxel struggled to process this information. He said that it seemed excessive. No other species in the galaxy maintained such extreme military readiness. Even the most aggressive empires did not fortify their home systems to this degree. It suggested a level of fear or paranoia that seemed almost pathological. Jake nodded and said that Craxel was right. By any normal standard, humanity's defensive preparations were excessive. But humans did not measure themselves by normal standards. They measured themselves by the standard of never again. Never again would they be unprepared. Never again would they be vulnerable. Never again would they trust that peace would last simply because people wanted it to last, he told Craxel that every human child learned about the collapse in school. They studied the wars and the plagues and the environmental disaster. They learned the names of the cities that had been destroyed and the leaders who had failed to stop it. They memorized the casualty figures and the timelines. By the time a human reached adulthood, they understood at a fundamental level that civilization was fragile and survival required constant vigilance. That knowledge shaped everything humanity did, including how they built their military and how they approached diplomacy and how they reacted when someone threatened Earth. The Valorian commander sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had been told. Finally, he asked whether humanity planned to invade Valorian territory. Would they take revenge for the attack on Titan? Would they destroy the Dominion the way they had destroyed his fleet? Jake shook his head and explained that humanity did not want revenge. They wanted justice for the civilians who had been killed, but justice did not require destroying an entire civilization. The Valorian government would face consequences. There would be trials and reparations. But Earth had no interest in conquest or occupation. Humanity had learned that lesson too during their own history. Empire building only led to more wars, more deaths, and more chances for everything to fall apart. Craxel looked back out the window at Earth turning below. He said that he understood now why the Council had not warned the Valorians. The older species assumed that anyone who looked at humanity would see what they really were. They assumed that the peaceful exterior was obviously a choice rather than a weakness. They assumed that no one would be foolish enough to attack a species that had survived self-inflicted apocalypse and then spent centuries making sure it could never happen again. The older species had been wrong. The Valorians had looked at Earth and seen only a small territory and a peaceful culture. They had not looked deeper. They had not asked the right questions. They had not wondered why such a peaceful species maintained such a massive military. Jake stood to leave but paused at the door. He told Kraxel that this conversation would be recorded and shared with the Valorian government. He hoped that future Valorian leaders would learn from this mistake. He hoped that other species would learn as well. The galaxy did not need more wars. There were enough real threats out there in the darkness between stars. Species should not be wasting time and lives fighting each other over territory or pride or misunderstanding. Humanity would defend itself when necessary, but they would always prefer peace. The key was making sure that everyone understood that preference for peace came from strength, not weakness. After Jake left, Kraxel sat alone.
In his cell and continued to stare at Earth. The planet looked so peaceful from orbit, so beautiful and calm. It was hard to believe that such a lovely world was home to a species that had nearly destroyed itself, and then built the most formidable defensive network in known space. But that was the truth about humanity. They were peaceful until they were not. They were kind until you gave them reason not to be. They would talk and negotiate and compromise right up until the moment you killed their civilians. After that, they became something else entirely. Not monsters, not savages. Something perhaps more frightening, which was professionals doing a job. They had spent centuries preparing to do dot for the first time since his capture. Kraxel felt something beyond shame and defeat. He felt a kind of respect mixed with fear. Humanity had beaten his fleet without breaking a sweat. They had done it while following the rules of war and treating prisoners well. They had shown mercy when they could have shown cruelty, and now they were offering peace when they could have demanded surrender. That combination of strength and restraint was something the Valorian military had never encountered before. It was something that Kraxel realized his people needed to learn if they were going to survive. In a galaxy where humanity existed, 3 weeks after the battle ended, the Valorian government officially surrendered and requested peace negotiations. The message came through official council channels and was delivered by a new Valorian ambassador who had replaced the previous one. The new ambassador was younger, and his first act was to issue a formal apology for the attack on Titan and the loss of human civilian lives. He stated that the previous military leadership had acted without proper authorization and that those responsible would face justice under Valorian law. It was a carefully worded statement that placed blame on individuals rather than the entire Dominion, but humanity accepted it as a starting point for talks. The peace conference was held in Geneva, which was a city in the European sector of Earth that had a long history of hosting diplomatic negotiations. The building chosen for the talks was old, by human standards, with stone walls and wooden floors that had witnessed countless treaties over the centuries. The Valorians arrived with a delegation of diplomats and legal experts, all of whom looked nervous about being on Earth itself. They had seen what humanity could do in space, and now they walked on the home world of a species that had beaten them so completely that the battle had become a legend before it was even over. President Karen Walsh opened the negotiations with a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy. She spoke about the importance of peace and the tragedy of unnecessary conflict. She expressed sorrow for the Valorian soldiers who had died following orders they believed were correct. She talked about the human civilians who had been killed on Titan and the families who would never recover from that loss. But she also spoke about the future and the possibility of building something better than endless cycles of violence and revenge. Her words were measured and diplomatic, but everyone listening understood the underlying message, which was that humanity could have destroyed the Valorian Dominion completely, but had chosen not to because they believed in something better. The negotiations took 2 weeks and covered everything from reparations to territorial boundaries to the treatment of prisoners. Lisa Hayes represented Earth's interests at the bargaining table, and she proved to be as skilled at diplomacy as she was at military planning. She pushed for significant reparations to compensate the families of those killed on Titan. She insisted on trials for the Valorian commanders who had ordered the attack. She demanded access to Valorian military records to understand how the decision to attack Earth had been made. But she also offered compromises where appropriate and showed willingness to consider Valorian concerns about their economy and their ability to pay. The final treaty was signed on a Tuesday morning with representatives from both species standing together while cameras recorded the moment for history. The Valorian Dominion agreed to pay reparations over a period of 20 years. The military officers responsible for the attack would be tried by an independent tribunal under council law. Valorian territory would remain independent, but they would accept human observers to ensure compliance with the treaty terms. In exchange, humanity agreed not to occupy Valorian worlds and to return all prisoners who were not facing criminal charges. It was not a perfect agreement, but it was fair, and both sides could accept it without feeling humiliated after the signing ceremony. Lisa found herself approached by Administrator Vexelin, who was the new leader of the Valorian delegation. He was older than most of the Valorians she had met, with scales that had faded to a pale gray that suggested age and experience. He asked if they could speak privately, and Lisa agreed. They walked through the gardens outside, the conference building where spring flowers were blooming and the air smelled of fresh growth. It was a reminder that Earth was a living world full of beauty that had nothing to do with weapons or war. Vexelin told Lisa that he had spent the past 3 weeks studying human history. He had read everything he could find about the collapse and the recovery and the centuries of preparation that followed. He said that he understood now what humanity was and why they had built their civilization the way they did, but he had a question that he could not answer from historical records alone. He asked whether humanity ever worried that their focus on military readiness might become a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether preparing so thoroughly for war might make war more likely rather than less likely. Lisa considered the question carefully before answering. She said that humanity worried about that constantly. It was one of the central debates in human politics and philosophy. Some people argued that the massive military was unnecessary and consumed resources that could be better spent elsewhere. Others argued that without the military, humanity would be vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack the Valorians had launched. The truth, she said, was probably somewhere in between. The military prevented wars by making potential enemies think twice, but it also required constant vigilance to make sure it remained defensive rather than aggressive. Humanity had learned that lesson during the collapse. They had learned that weapons were tools, and like any tool, they could be used for good or ill depending on who controlled them. She told Vexelin that every human child learned not just about the weapons and the defenses, but also about why those things existed. They learned that the purpose of strength was to protect, not to conquer. They learned that the purpose of preparation was to prevent war, not to make it easier. They learned that every weapon built came with a responsibility to use it wisely or not at all. That education was as important as the weapons themselves, because without it, humanity would just be another aggressive species with powerful technology. With it, they were something different, which was a species that had survived their own worst impulses and chosen to be better. Back at the Galactic Council, the representatives were updating their records on humanity. The battle with the Valorians had revealed details about human military capabilities that had been suspected, but never confirmed. Now the Council had clear data on shield strength and weapon range and the sheer scale of Earth's defensive network. Speaker Thauron personally oversaw the creation of a new designation in the Galactic database. Humanity would be classified as peaceful but extremely dangerous if provoked. The recommendation for all species was to maintain friendly diplomatic relations and under no circumstances engage in hostile action against Earth or human interests. Ambassador Valmaria added a note to the official record that would become famous in the years to come. She wrote that humans were kind and welcoming and genuinely interested in peaceful cooperation. They contributed to galactic culture through art and science and philosophy. They were good neighbors and reliable trading partners. But every human, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, understood that their civilization had nearly died once, and they had spent centuries making sure it never happened again. Any species that looked at humanity and saw weakness was making a fatal error of judgment. The peaceful exterior was not a mask hiding aggression. It was a choice made by a species strong enough to choose peace over violence. The choice should be respected because the alternative was what happened to the Valorians on Earth. Life slowly returned to normal. Admiral Jake Brennan retired from active service and moved to a small house in Montana, where he could see mountains and forests and clear skies. He spent his days hiking and reading and occasionally giving lectures at military academies about the importance of proportional response. Commander Lisa Hayes accepted a position teaching strategy at the Naval Academy, where she would influence the next generation of officers. The captured Valorian ships were studied carefully and then scrapped, with the materials being recycled into civilian infrastructure, but the defensive network remained active and alert. The orbital platforms continued their silent watch. The hidden bases on moons and asteroids stayed ready. The warships that had destroyed the Valorian fleet returned to patrol duties and training exercises. Humanity did not disarm or reduce their military readiness. The victory had proven that their approach worked. The sacrifice of previous generations had created a shield that protected Earth and all its people. That shield would remain in place, because humanity never forgot and they never stopped preparing. In schools across Earth, children learned about the battle as part of their history curriculum. They learned about the Valorians who had attacked Titan. They learned about the human response that had been swift and overwhelming, but also measured and professional. They learned that humanity had offered the Valorians a chance to surrender before the shooting started. They learned that prisoners had been treated well and that the peace treaty had been fair rather than vengeful. The lessons were designed to teach multiple things at once. First, that humanity could defend itself against any threat. Second, that strength should be used responsibly. Third, that the goal was always peace even when war became necessary. On a distant world in a classroom, filled with young aliens of a dozen different species, a teacher displayed an image of Earth. The planet looked beautiful, hanging in the darkness of space with its blue oceans and white clouds and green continents. The teacher asked the class what they knew about humanity, and the students offered various answers. Some talked about human art and music. Others mentioned human scientific achievements. One student who had clearly done extra research mentioned that Earth was the most heavily defended planet in the known galaxy. The teacher nodded and said that all of those things were true. Humans were creative and curious and friendly. They made beautiful art and cutting-edge technology. They welcomed visitors and participated actively in galactic society, but they also maintained a military force that could defeat any aggressor. The teacher explained that this combination might seem contradictory, but it actually made perfect sense when you understood human history. Humans had learned through terrible experience that civilization was fragile and peace required constant protection. They had built their entire society around the principle that they would never be vulnerable again. The teacher showed footage from the battle with the Valorians. The students watched in silence as human ships appeared out of nowhere and disabled an entire fleet in less than 2 hours. They saw the precision of the human weapons and the strength of the human shields. They saw how the humans had captured rather than killed when possible. One young student asked if humans were the strongest species in the galaxy. The teacher thought about that question before answering. She said that strongest was hard to define because different species had different advantages. But in terms of defensive capability and ability to protect, their homeworld, humanity, was certainly among the most formidable species anyone had ever encountered. Another student asked why humanity maintained such extreme defenses if they were peaceful. The teacher smiled and said that was exactly the right question to ask. She explained that humanity was peaceful because they were strong, not despite it. They could afford to be kind and welcoming because they did not fear attack. They could afford to negotiate and compromise because they knew that if negotiations failed, they could protect themselves. Their strength gave them the freedom to be peaceful. Without that strength, they would have to be aggressive or cautious or constantly worried about survival. With it, they could focus on building and creating and exploring. The lesson ended with the teacher giving the students an assignment. They were to research another species that had survived a major catastrophe and compare how that species had responded versus how humanity had responded. The goal was to understand that there were many paths forward after tragedy, and that humanity had chosen one particular path that worked for them. Other species might choose differently. There was no single right answer, but every species needed to understand the choices they made and the consequences of those choices. The students filed out discussing the assignment and debating whether humanity's approach was wise or excessive. The teacher remained behind looking at the image of Earth still displayed on the screen. She had visited Earth once many years ago and had been struck by how normal everything seemed. Humans going about their daily lives completely unaware that they lived on the most fortified world in the galaxy. Children playing in parks that sat above underground bunkers. Families having picnics within sight of orbital platforms that could destroy fleets. That contrast between everyday life and extreme preparedness was uniquely human. They had learned to live with constant readiness without letting it consume them or make them paranoid. That balance was perhaps their greatest achievement, greater even than their technology or their military victories across the galaxy. The story of the battle spread and became part of the common knowledge that every species shared. When new civilizations achieved faster than light travel and joined the galactic community, one of the first things they learned was that Earth should be treated with respect. Not because humans were aggressive or expansionist, but because they were survivors who had decided that survival meant being prepared for anything. That knowledge prevented wars and saved lives because species that might have otherwise tested humanity's resolve understood that there was nothing to gain and everything to lose from such a test. And on Earth, humanity continued their work of building and exploring and creating while always maintaining the shield that protected them all.